We start a new series this morning. For the next 4 weeks, we want to just engage with a couple of ideas and thoughts that hopefully you'll find helpful. They're on page 93 of your journal. If you've got your journal, you might want to sort of take some notes on that, or that might be something that you want to go back to and sort of reflect on. Different people use their journals in different ways. Some people use it to write in on during the service. Other people take it home and they kind of fill it out when they get home with some thoughts or some ideas. Some people use it just to see if they can remember anything I've said tomorrow. But I encourage you to think about that. That process of being able to take notes and look back at them is actually quite an important one. It's really great. When I was moving to come over here from the UK, I was packing up all of my files and found some of my undergraduate essays. And I was really surprised they let me pass. Based on what I'd written there. But actually it became a moment for me to think, wow, I've kind of come a long way since those days. And when we take notes, that's one of the things we get to see when we kind of freeze moments in our history and we look back at it. The same experience you get when you look at pictures from 10 years ago and you think, man, all my clothes have shrunk. They used to fit me way baggier than they do now. I must change how I wash them, because that's the problem there, right? Is it too early for a weight joke in this sort of way? I don't know. So we're beginning this new series called Habit, and this is part of the reason why I want you to think about sort of your note-taking and your journaling and how you journey, because in this series there's an invitation to you to think about the habits and the practices and essentially the things that you do. And I want us to sort of reflect a little bit on that, particularly in terms of our discipleship, as people who follow Jesus. What is that looking like when we work that out in our lives? Beneath this series, there's a book by the Canadian philosopher James K.A. Smith called You Are What You Love. I'm unapologetic in saying that a lot of the sort of formation of this series was influenced by that particular book. I would encourage you to buy a copy and read it. I've yet to meet anyone that's read it and said that was a waste of time. It won Book of the Year from Christianity Today last year. This book's a really interesting shaping thinking about the practices that we're involved in our lives. So if this series doesn't convince you to read it by the end, then nothing will. But I just want to cite my sources a little bit. Otherwise, you're just going to get bored of me saying, oh yeah, and this is in chapter 3. So we're kind of rooting our ideas in a particular thought process. Jamie Smith begins his process. And, by the way, just to be clear, the series isn't just me reading the book. I could do that if you think that would be better. I could just do a different chapter every week, but my wife, everybody. It wasn't actually, it was my wife's friend. And there's a huge gap between your friends and your wife's friends, right? Do you ever experience a gap between what you know and what you do? There's a reflective question for you. Do you ever experience a gap between what you know and what you do? Or let me ask it a slightly different way. Do you ever find yourself encountering new information? Information that you find really interesting, information that you find true, information that you think, wow, this should really change things for me, and it doesn't actually involve a new way of life. Do you ever hear a good sermon that makes very little difference on Monday? Or let me ask you this question, or maybe you can relate to this experience. I know a decent amount, given that it's not my specialist subject, I know a decent amount about fats and trans fats and saturated fats, right? I know about the intake of sugar and how sugar metabolizes to fat within our systems. I know what that does to our internal organs. I have a good idea about what my required caloric intake is, and I know the best ways to deliver those calories to my system, right? These are all things that as an endurance runner you have to learn. And yet, when I see the golden arches, all of that knowledge counts for not a lot, and all of that thinking hasn't got a chance. When I'm tired, or I've just come from the mountains, or it's been a long day, or I missed breakfast before a sermon, it's really hard to get home past those golden arches, despite what I think. And before you judge, let me just say this. There are two types of people in the world. People who like McDonald's and people who lie. We all know it's socially unacceptable to admit that you like it, but we all have this dark secret that rarely does a year get by that we don't find ourselves in that line. This, what we'll call McDonald's syndrome for a moment, is not new thinking. Here we have three philosophers from the ancient era, all broadly contemporary with the New Testament: Ovid, Epictetus, and Seneca. I know you've read them all. Here's three quotes from them. Ovid says this: "Desire persuades me one way, reason another. I see the better and approve it, but I follow the worse. What I wish," says Epictetus, "I do not do, and what I do not wish, I do." And Seneca says it like this: "I know what you say is true, but passion forces me to take the worser path." Greco-Roman philosophers, broadly speaking, 2,000 years ago, were convinced on the power of the brain. The brain is an incredible organ, the way that it works, the capacity that it has. And we're the same to this day. We're convinced that our brains are brilliant. Some of us are convinced that our brains are brillianter than others. But that's a different sermon where we'll talk about different things. And yet, despite this, despite over 2 millennia of us thinking about how brilliant our brains are, we all nod in agreement at the ancient wisdom of Ovid, Epictetus, and Seneca when they say these things. We relate to that. 2,000 years of human history, human progress, as we so regularly call it, later, and a statement like, what I wish I do not do and what I do not wish I do, we relate to. As rationalists, intellectualists that we say we are, our model of the human in the contemporary West is about us as thinking people. We're sharp, we're clever. Our whole kind of cultural process is weighed on this idea that I think, therefore I am. Thinking is what we do as humans. It's what makes us different from the rest of the animals, right? And we've turned it into an industry. There's almost nothing you can do in life today that you aren't encouraged to think better about. Just think about how much time you think about thinking. If you want to do something new, most of us nowadays go and find a book on it. Or we go to YouTube and find somebody that'll teach us how to do it. We figure if I can get my brain right on this particular subject, then, I will be better at it. Hence, we have, whether it's from growing flowers to having a better marriage, there's books and courses and programs that you can go to improve your thinking. Because if you can improve your thinking, we say, then you'll improve the way that you live. And we all agree to that. We all think that's the way it is, and we all have probably spent large amounts of money enforcing that idea in our lives. And yet, we throw up 2,000-year-old philosophers on screen, and we all nod in agreement and go, oh yeah, I get that. Despite all of the books that I've read on behavior, despite all of the books that I've read on being married, despite all of the books I've read on how to make your yard look pretty, these things don't seem to always come through in my day-to-day life. This is not isolated thinking. Perhaps you recognize this idea more popularly like this. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 15, and then later in verse 18, St. Paul writes to this church, and here's an opening statement for you: I do not understand what I do. I don't want a show of hands. But have you ever said that about yourself? Monthly? Daily? Hourly? Do you ever find yourself midway through something thinking to yourself, what am I doing right now? Like, why am I in this argument? Why am I saying these things? Why am I lecturing through the glass of my car to the inferior driver beside me? Why am I doing this? I don't understand it. I know it's not making any difference. I know it's changing nothing. And yet here I am, committed to this. Paul continues, for what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. This is one of those Bible verses you have slight nerves about reading publicly. You just say do a lot and hope that it works out for the best. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate to do, I do. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. Now, Paul involves himself in an argument that was broad in the Greco-Roman world. And you can hear it, having heard the three philosophers similar to him, you can hear the echoes of their thoughts in what Paul's saying here. Paul's involved in a much bigger argument in Romans at the time. He's trying to get to the root of why this is. This human problem of brokenness, this human dysfunction we have in our relationships with God. But these verses here, in terms of how we're going to engage with them in this series, we're going to spin off a little bit from that broader argument that Paul's involved in and ask ourselves, why is it that with all of this advancement that we have in the contemporary world, with 2 millennia from Paul to us of human progress, why is it we still relate to a statement like this? Why is it that a group of 21st century Calgarians look at something that was written by a Jewish rabbi in the 1st century and go, yeah, I relate to that? And this is not just theology that we're talking about now. You could just wander around your workplace and discuss this verse with people. And most people will say, yeah, I get that. For some reason, I can have all of these thoughts about what it is that I want to do, and they don't always relate, don't ever relate to what it is that I actually do. Maybe, and here's my question that I want to ask us at the beginning of a series like this, maybe our intellect isn't as powerful as we think it is. Now, I'm not an anti-intellectualist. I hope you've picked that up from me by now. I do think that our version of what we think is intellect in the contemporary world is flawed. I think we assume that we're on an improving scale. I think there's an arrogance within contemporary culture, particularly contemporary Western culture, that we think we are better than everybody who's come before us. We assume that we do society better and community better and business better and relationships better and parenting better. Heck, we even think we do the Bible better and understand it better nowadays. In every aspect of Western culture, there seems to be this subtle arrogance that says we are better. This is, of course, despite any evidence whatsoever that this is true. But that's how powerful our thinkers are, that we can convince ourselves of things even without the evidence. Because we are brilliant, we say. Look at what we've done. Look at the things we can build. Look at the places we can go. We've got pictures of Earth from the moon. Clearly, we're clever. Clearly, we've got it all together. And yet, I do not do the things I want to do. And we say, yeah, that's true. And get to the moon, right? But trying to give up fast food, that's a real problem. This is because our brilliant brains, as incredible as they are, the thinking machines that we have in our skulls, all have one thing in common. They're incredibly lazy. Your brain is lazy. Your brain doesn't like working. It doesn't like doing the hard work that you ask it to. As one psychologist said, broadly speaking, only about 5% of what we do in a given day is the outcome of conscious, deliberate choices we make. 5%. I should have been cruel and asked for a vote, but how much of your brain do you think is given to conscious decision making? 5%. So the next time that you look at a robot potentially taking your job, it's because actually you're only about 5% different from a robot. Because 95% of what we do is actually done without thinking. We actually are involved in these automatic processes that we get ourselves into, and we just live our lives in these ways which are, broadly speaking, often our brains are working, not doing the things that we often think they are. A little bit of science as best as I understand this. Right at the center of your brain, you have this kind of bit of neurological tissue that is probably pronounced something like the basal ganglia. This part of your brain comes alive whenever you're doing things. This part of your brain is working when you're involved in any actions, thought processes, even emotional engagements. What's interesting is that this part of your brain and all of your brain seems to light up when you're doing new things. It comes alive when you're involved in a new process. It's as if when you're doing something you've never done before, this bit of your brain tells the rest of your brain to turn everything up to 11. Pay attention, we're doing something different. This is why, by the way, learning something new is tiring. Because your brain's got to really work at it. You ever had a new job? And you come home from work the first day of your new job and you're really tired. And you're like, this is what I'm trained for. This is what I was doing at my last job. But for some reason, today it seems more difficult. Well, that's because your desk's in a different place. Your company is in a different place. They keep the coffee in a different place. Your mug's stored in a different place. You have different people to meet, different conversations to have, different things to trip over, different stairs to climb up and different stairs to climb down. Your brain's had to do a lot of work in the course of that day. It's also why it's hard to learn a musical instrument, because there's all this new stuff to process. This bit at the center of your brain is constantly looking at what you're doing, constantly working hard to look for patterns and sequences and repeatable aspects of what you do. Because it wants to make your life manageable. And so as you do things more regularly, this bit of your brain is learning those processes so that it can repeat them without the rest of your brain being involved. So that you can get involved in these day-to-day activities without having to think too hard about it. Here's a thought experiment for you. I'd love you to go on with me right now. How much thought did you actually put this morning into the decision-making process to put toothpaste on your toothbrush? Can you actually think about when that happened? If you can't remember at all, then just apologize briefly to the person sat next to you. They would really appreciate that. But for most of us, somewhere in that morning process, we grab our toothbrush and everything sort of takes over. The next thing you're doing this and you're cleaning your teeth and however it is that you do it. And it's all sort of happening. And there's probably a whole sequence of events happen that in that particular way. You find yourself in the bathroom and it's as if you go into robot mode. You don't even, let's be honest here, you don't even need to be that awake. Your body can kind of just do it. Let me ask a more probing question. Have you ever turned up somewhere like work and wondered how you got there? Have you ever arrived and you just have that moment where you sit in your car and thinking, how did I arrive here? If somebody was to stop you at that moment and say, what route did you take? You wouldn't be confident that you could speak to that. And you just pray briefly that there's not a trail of carnage when you look in your rear view mirror. Have you ever wondered about why it's so easy to tie your shoes without even thinking about it, but that new iPhone update has really caused you problems? And this is because our brains are constantly looking for the things that we do repeatedly. It's called the science of chunking. Our brain looks at big chunks of what we do and says, can I automate that? Can I draw that into my regular habits, my regular day-to-day existence, and therefore make it just happen? So ironically enough, the root of how our habits form, the roots of how the things that we do happen, doesn't come through thinking. Actually, it comes through not thinking. Our brain doesn't want, can you imagine how tiring it would be if you had to think in detail about the toothpaste on your toothbrush thing every single time? Like you'd need a break just by the time you got to the breakfast table because of all the thinking you would have to do. Can you remember watching a child learn to walk? And can you imagine if it was still that hard to walk? It's very rare that you get up in the morning and thank God for your basal ganglia, but you would be really tired if you had to put as much effort into walking as an 11-month-old did. Because your brain learns it and repeats this passage. Goodness me, some of us can walk and talk at the same time. Most of the time. Occasionally there's falls in the process, right? And this is your brain being efficient. This is your brain doing at some level what it was designed to do, to allow you to stop thinking about your basic everyday behaviors. That would be tiring. So your brains look for particular cues that tell it to start activating automatic routines. I'm in the bathroom and holding a toothbrush. Don't worry, your brain says, I got this. And your brain can now get back to doing the other things that you're thinking about, like what will happen in that Netflix series when I watch it more tonight. And I wonder if I can get that deal from the store that I was looking for. Your brain really wants to get back to working on that, so it automates these processes. The reward for it doing that is that you get done what you need to get done. And this cycle of a cue that tells you to go automatic, a routine that is the automatic process, and then finally the reward that you get things done. If that keeps happening in a loop regularly enough, you end up with a habit. And when a habit emerges, your brain stops fully participating in the decision-making process. So unless you deliberately fight it, It will just happen automatically. Now, we have a tendency to think about habits as bad things, right? But you need them. Your brain would shut down, overwhelmed by the minutiae of day-to-day life if it had to think everything through all the time. The problem is this: your brain's not very good at telling the difference between a bad habit and a good habit. It just learns the routines that you put it through. So all of those good habits that you've worked really hard at are doing the same thing in your brain as when you chew your nails. Charles Duhigg, in his book, The Power of Habit, says this: we might not remember the experiences that create our habits, but once they are lodged within our brains, they influence how we act, often without realization. Habits are powerful but delicate. They can emerge outside of our consciousness or can be deliberately designed. They often occur without our permission. They are so strong, in fact, that they cause our brains to cling to them at the exclusion of all else, including common sense. And all those of us who have tried to break a habit said, amen. We relate to this. We understand this. The cues that set us off into these automatic routines can become so entrenched in our way of being that they almost feel impossible to stop. People who have broken habits talk about how even once they knew that the thing that they were doing was wrong, if they found themselves in particular situations that cued a particular sort of set of sequences, they found themselves drawn into this habit. By the way, this is well known about the human. This is why every McDonald's looks the same. Because they want to do as little as possible to knock your cue. They want you to walk into a McDonald's and the automatic processes of your brain start to take over, that you will do the very things that you always do when you're there. There are other fast food restaurants that will kill you. I'm just picking on the biggest one this morning. I hope that's okay. This is all to say this: we're not thinking our way out of this, because actually our own brains are working against us thinking our way out of this. The evidence seems to be weighted both in the philosophers and in the sciences that just thinking about things won't take away the cues. It won't take away that need to be rewarded by whatever it is you do that this habit speaks to. Our brains are fighting us to stay automatic, and our thinking's not often good enough to get us out of that. So this takes us to a different bit of St. Paul. In Philippians chapter 1 and verse 9 through 11, Paul writes to one of his favorite churches. You're not supposed to have favorite churches in an apostle, but I get the feeling that Philippi was Paul's. And he says this to them about what his prayer is for them. This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ, to the glory and praise of God. If you read a passage like this too quickly, you can come to the assumption that this is just the same as everything else. This is just another example of thinking right. Is Paul just simply saying, have the right knowledge, and that will do the right things? But look closely at this verse. Before Paul talks about having the right knowledge, he talks about love. He talks about them having a love that would abound. And from that abounding love comes a knowledge. So often our logic is, we know things and then we figure out how to love them. What Paul's pushing at here is, what if you loved things and figured out how to know them? What if you were actually to give your love to something and that would be the thing that teaches you? That would be the thing that changes you. So rather than Paul saying, think differently and that will make you the type of people that Jesus wants us to be, what Paul says is love differently, and that will make you the type of people that Jesus wants us to be, and it will make you think differently. Because our hearts are shaped by what we love. It's the things that we give our hearts to, it's the things that we give our lives to that actually shape our habits. If habits are developed by what we do regularly, it's not so much about what we think about that, it's about what we do that's going to adjust that. It's about how we engage in that process of, what am I giving my life to? And most of us give our lives to the things we love. Sometimes, and we'll talk about this more throughout this series, sometimes the things we love are not the things we should love. Sometimes the things we love need to be recalibrated, need to be reset. But the things we love are the things that shape us. James K.A. Smith, in his book, You Are What You Love, says this: because love is a habit, our hearts are calibrated through imitating exemplars and being immersed in practices that over time index our hearts to a certain end. We learn to love then, not primarily by acquiring information about what we should love, but rather through practices that form the habits of how we love. Intuitively, we know this. Intuitively, we know in our relationships, for example, that what we do, the how of our love, is far more impacting than what we happen to think about it. And it's in doing, but the problem is that in our contemporary culture, we think, well, let's straighten out our brains and that will change what we do. The biblical logic, which seems to be increasingly being confirmed by brain science. The biblical logic is, no, don't think well so that you will do well, but do well so that you will think well. Because your actions become the rituals that form and direct your thoughts and your affections. So back to the question that we started with, why is there a gap between what you know and what you do? For St. Paul, the answer is we love the wrong things. If we're not doing what we think we should be doing, it's not so much our thinking, but it's our actions that are problems. If we're investing our loves into the wrong things, then we're going to have the wrong results. Our habits are going to be destructive. Unfortunately, our habits can be broken. It takes time, it takes the right type of effort, but they can be changed. We can learn to love differently. We can learn to love the right things, and in doing so, be shaped by who they are and what they do to us. St. Augustine, in his book Confessions, said this: you have made us for yourselves, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. If our loves and our actions are formed and aimed by what we've immersed our lives into, then there's this theological logic that kind of traces its way throughout Christianity, which calls us to think about what it is that we love. For St. Augustine, we're on this journey to find a love in which God settles us and rests us. And everything else we do, every habit we involve ourselves in that doesn't point us towards that, ultimately just increases our anxiety and our restlessness. Because see, the question for us as humans is not, will you love something? The question is, what will you love? We'll all give our lives to something. We'll all invest our lives in something. And if we invest our lives in the wrong things, as many of us will tell you, breaking out of those things requires some hard work. Breaking out of those investments and those affections is difficult because for so long have we done it this way. If you've ever tried as a Christian to do something new, how many Christians would tell you that they have regularly tried to commit themselves to, perhaps my devotional life should improve, perhaps I should pray more, perhaps I should read my Bible more. And this simple act of trying to invest the reading of a few verses of Scripture into my daily experience seems so difficult because of all these other habits that are in there that are causing us to fight the change. Throughout this series, we want to talk a little bit about that change. We want to talk a little bit about how we identify what it is within our habits that makes them so hard for us to break. And we also want to lean into some new habits. For us to be disciples of Jesus, to be followers of Jesus, asks us to act differently. You've been in church more than enough times to hear enough thinking to affect what you do if it worked that way. And there's this resistance within the contemporary church still, I think, to assume that if we can all just think better, it'll all work out okay. But what we're beginning to see in the sciences, but actually is deeply rooted there in the theology of Scripture, is that we need to stop thinking that we can think differently and change everything and actually start doing differently. Jesus walked up to some disciples one day, or potential disciples rather one day. He didn't say, think about me. He didn't even say believe in me at that point. He said, follow me. And over 3 years, he taught them practices. And in the doing of those practices, their hearts were changed. And the changing of those hearts, their minds and their actions were changed. And that's the journey that the Bible calls us to. And so I want to begin perhaps this series for the next few weeks with an invitation to you. what I'd like you to think about doing throughout this series, and I want to pause all 4 parts of this series and give you something practical to work on. But I want you to think about your habits. I'm apologizing for that sentence because it uses the word think, but I want you to think about your habits for a moment or two. Maybe take some space this evening or tomorrow morning, whenever it is that you find some quiet space, and have a look at what you do. Take it seriously for a moment. Perhaps sketch out a week on your notepad or just a day and talk yourself through your day, trying to take identity of which of these bits are automatic and which of these bits am I thinking about and intentionally doing. And the bits that you're doing automatically, ask yourself this question: am I happy with that? I always go here for coffee. I always eat here. I drive this route. Is this why am I doing that? And the more important question, what is that doing to you? Which habits do you have in your regular life that are formative and good? What are your conversations like? What's your engagement with your discipleship of Jesus like? Your scripture reading, your prayer, your kindness, your grace towards others. Let me ask you a really important question that gets lost in our contemporary busy life. Where do you eat? Do you eat alone or with the people that you love? One of the most transformative things that you can do in your life is to eat with the people you love. And leave your technology behind for a moment. Have conversations. Find out what's going on in their lives. What are they carrying? What do you need to pray for? What do you need to journey with them in? And our society is pushing us away from these good forming habits to say, eat in your car, or eat in front of the television, or eat quickly as you move from places to places. And it's fine, you can take in calories whenever you need and your body happily uses them. But what you lose in the habit of spending time with the people you love is way more destructive than we often think it is. So what formative and good habits do you have? What negative and deformative habits do you have? Look at your phone usage, your internet usage, your various things that you're involved in, and decide, how is that shaping me? Essentially, the question is, let's take a habits audit. Let's pay attention to our lives for a week. Let's look at what we do, and let's think about it intentionally. Just for a day or a week if you're feeling adventurous. Think through it, analyze it, wonder about it, and lead yourselves to a question: why? Why do I do this? And beneath that question, perhaps more importantly, am I happy that I do this? Are these habits forming me into the type of person that I want to be? We all know this experience of going on vacation. And while you're on vacation, you have an epiphany. I need to sort out my life. Many of us have that vacation epiphany. Life's too busy. Life's too chaotic. I need to sort things out, get things in order. And I come back from this vacation. I'm going to eat better. I'm going to exercise better. I'm going to see more friends. Am I the only person that thinks that? How many days back at work are you until you get to, it's as if I never went away? I'm just doing the same old things, because our thinking process is absolutely right. Maybe we do need to analyze, but as soon as the old habits kick in again, we're back into the normal routines. One more year gets spent just doing what we always did until next vacation, when I try and think about it differently again. So let me invite you to think differently. Ask this question prayerfully. What am I doing, and am I happy with that? While you're doing that, perhaps you can think about what you love. Perhaps you can think about what you don't love and would like to love. And perhaps you can think about what you do love and would like not to love. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, said Augustine, and our hearts are restless until they rest